the dog wouldn't stop. That was the first thing Frank noticed when he stepped out of the truck and stretched his back against the cold morning air. Biscuit, a 7-year-old golden retriever with a gray muzzle and eyes that had seen too much, was already at the side door of the old woodshed, pawing at the gap between the frame and the rotting pine boards. Not scratching the way dogs do when they smell a mouse, digging, methodical, like he knew exactly what he was looking for. "Easy, boy," Frank said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the way it always did before his first coffee. Biscuit didn't look back. Frank Caldwell had driven 11 hours from Red Deer to get here. He hadn't planned to stop for anything. Not for the rain outside of Edmonton. Not for the Tim Hortons lineup in Hinton. Not for the memory that caught him somewhere in the Yellowhead Pass, when the light hit the mountains a certain way, and made him think of his father for the first time in years, without wanting to put the radio up loud and drown it out. He had driven straight through because that's what he did when something needed doing. 40 years in the Canadian Army had taught him that much, at least. When orders come, you move. Even when the orders are just a phone call from a lawyer's office in Cranbrook, telling you that your father is dead, and that you, Francis Allen Caldwell, are the sole heir to a property you haven't set foot on in over 30 years. The property was 17 acres in the East Kootenay region of British Columbia, backed up against a ridge of Douglas fir and hemlock that his father had always called the Green Wall. There was a main house, 2 stories, cedar siding gone gray. The porch railing Frank had helped nail in when he was 14, still standing somehow, and behind it, 2 outbuildings. A storage shed, and the woodshed where Biscuit was now fully committed to tearing through the doorframe with both front paws. Frank stood there in the gravel and watched him for a moment. He thought about his father, about the last time they'd spoken, which had been almost 4 years ago. A phone call that lasted 9 minutes and ended the way most of their conversations ended, not with a fight, but with a quiet that was somehow worse than a fight. His father's name was Stuart. Stuart James Caldwell. He had been 78 years old and had died alone in the main house on a Thursday morning in February. And his nearest neighbor, a woman named Dolores, who ran a small hobby farm 2 kilometers down the road, had noticed the lights on for 3 nights straight and called it in. Frank hadn't been there. He pulled the key from his jacket pocket, an old thing iron that the lawyer had mailed to him in a padded envelope along with 14 pages of estate documents, and walked toward the woodshed. "All right," he said to Biscuit, "show me. Before we get into what was in that shed, I want you to tell me something. Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. This story is for you." Frank had not been what anyone would call a sentimental man. That wasn't a criticism, just a fact. The Army had taken the soft edges off him young and replaced them with something more useful. Precision, endurance, the ability to sleep for 4 hours and function at full capacity. His ex-wife, Renee, had said once that loving him was like trying to hold on to water. He hadn't argued. He'd known even then that she was probably right. They had a son. His name was Theo, and he was 34 now, and lived in Halifax with his partner and a baby girl named Margot, who Frank had met exactly once, at Christmas, when she was 6 weeks old and had fallen asleep against his chest, in a way that made something in him go very still and very quiet. He hadn't known what to do with that feeling. He still didn't. Theo had offered to come with him to Cranbrook. Frank had said no. He told himself it was because the drive was long and Theo had a family now and couldn't just leave. He told himself that a lot of things on the drive out. Most of them were partially true. The key fit the woodshed padlock on the 3rd try. The door swung inward with a sound like something exhaling after a long time of holding its breath. Biscuit shot through before Frank could stop him. The shed was bigger than it looked from outside. Maybe 12 by 14 feet, with rough-cut shelving along 2 walls, and a workbench running the full length of the 3rd. Above the workbench, pegboard, with the outlines of tools still drawn in black marker, the ghosts of a hammer, a hand saw, a set of chisels, though most of the tools themselves were gone. The floor was packed earth, covered in the middle by a piece of old rubber mat that had cracked and curled at the corners. It smelled of cedar oil and something else, something close and dry, like old paper. Biscuit was at the back left corner, nose pressed to the junction where the wall met the floor. He made a sound Frank had never heard from him before. Low, not quite a whine, more like a question. "What is it?" Frank said, quieter now. He crossed the shed and crouched beside the dog, one knee on the rubber mat. He put his hand where Biscuit's nose was pointing and felt it immediately. A draft. Faint, but there. Cold air moving through a gap that had no business being there between a wall and a dirt floor. He pressed his palm flat against the lower section of the wallboards. They didn't flex. He moved his hand up 6 inches and pressed again. There, the faintest give. Not rot. Something deliberate. He looked more carefully and saw it. A seam cut cleanly and then painted over, running vertically about 18 inches from the corner. And at the bottom of that seam, barely visible under a smear of old sawdust, a small brass fitting. A catch. Frank sat back on his heels and looked at his dog. Biscuit looked back at him with those amber eyes, patient and certain. "How long have you known?" Frank asked, which was a ridiculous thing to say to a dog. But Biscuit wagged once, slow and deliberate, and Frank laughed for the first time in what felt like several weeks. He pressed the catch, and the panel swung open. Behind it was a space roughly the size of a closet, 3 feet deep, maybe 5 feet wide, shelved on the inside. And on those shelves, carefully arranged, was what Frank could only describe as a record of his entire life. Not his whole life. His father hadn't been there for most of it. That was the whole problem. But there were photographs Frank had never seen. Pictures of himself at his commissioning ceremony. Taken from a distance, the kind of picture someone takes when they're not sure they're welcome, but they come anyway. A newspaper clipping from 2003, with a small mention of his regiment's deployment. A printed copy of an article from an Alberta military journal, 2009, about a peacekeeping operation Frank had led in Cyprus, with his name circled in pencil. His father had been following his career from a distance for 30 years. Frank sat down on the floor of the woodshed. He wasn't sure when he decided to sit down. His legs just stopped working in the normal way, and the floor came up to meet him. Biscuit pressed himself against Frank's side and stayed there. There were letters too, sealed envelopes, each with a date written in the top corner in his father's handwriting. The handwriting Frank remembered from birthday cards that had arrived every year without fail until he was 22, and told his father, in terms that weren't kind, to stop sending them. The envelopes were dated from 1991 through to last December. 33 years of letters that had never been sent. Frank didn't open them right away. He sat in the cold shed with his dog and the dust and the smell of cedar and just breathed for a while. Then he picked up the one dated February of this year, the most recent one, the one his father had written, apparently, about 2 weeks before he died. The handwriting was shakier now, but it was still him. "Francis, I don't suppose you'll find this. You might sell the property without ever going near the shed. That would be practical. And you've always been a practical man. I think I made you that way, and I'm sorry for the parts that cost you. But if you are reading this, then Biscuit found it. I taught him where it was last summer, when you brought him up for that one afternoon, and I could tell you weren't going to stay. Dogs remember things people pretend not to notice. I want to tell you about the land." It took Frank 3 readings to get through the letter without stopping. His father had bought the property in 1974, the year before Frank was born. He had worked it alone for most of Frank's childhood, while Frank's mother, Catherine, managed the books and raised the kids in Lethbridge. The distance, 4 hours, but it might as well have been 400, had worn the marriage down slowly, the way cold does to concrete. By the time Frank was 12, his parents' separation had become permanent in everything but paperwork. By the time he was 16, he'd chosen sides the way teenagers do, loudly, entirely, without room for anything complicated. He'd chosen his mother, He'd told himself for 30 years that this was the right thing to do. The letter didn't argue with that. His father, and this was the part that broke Frank open in a way he hadn't expected. His father didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He didn't try to explain himself or reframe the past in a more flattering light. He simply described the land, the ridge of fir, the creek that ran along the north fence line that froze over in January and thawed by March, the way the light came across the valley on clear evenings in October. He wrote about what the land had meant to him, not as a possession, but as a place where he had always been able to think clearly, and where he had gone. He said, when the silence of the estrangement became too loud, "I am leaving it to you because it's yours by right, and because I believe you'll know what to do with it. I've watched long enough to know that you take care of things. You always have. Even when I wasn't there to see it, I knew. I would have liked more time. But I should have said that 30 years ago. And I didn't. And here we are." Your father, Stuart Frank, spent 2 nights in the main house before he found the other thing. He'd been going through the desk in the back bedroom, his father's study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a map of the Kootenay region pinned to one wall with small notations in pencil, when he found the folder. Brown cardboard, elasticized, the kind you'd get at a Staples. Inside was a document from a land title office and a letter from a development company called Pallister Resources out of Calgary. The letter was dated 8 months ago. It was an offer to purchase the 17 acres for a figure that made Frank read it twice. The land sat along a corridor that Pallister had identified as viable for a private resort development. Access to Crown land, mountain views, proximity to the ski area. The letter was friendly and professional, and explained that the offer would lapse if not responded to within 90 days of the property transferring to a new owner. There was a handwritten note clipped to the front of the letter in his father's writing. "Do not sign. Do not call them back. This is not what the land is for." Frank set the folder down and stood at the window and looked out at the ridge. He thought about the commission. It would clear every debt he had and leave enough to live on comfortably for the rest of his life. He thought about Theo and Margot, and whether money like that could fix some of the distance that had accumulated between them, the same way it had accumulated between Frank and his own father. Then he thought about what his father had written. "You'll know what to do with it." Biscuit came and sat beside him at the window. "What do you think?" Frank said. The dog looked out at the ridge. He called Theo that night, not to ask for advice. Frank Caldwell did not ask for advice, but because he found himself wanting to hear his son's voice in a way that surprised him. Theo answered on the second ring, already alert the way new parents are, always half listening for something going wrong. "Dad, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Frank said. "I'm at the property. I found some things of your grandfather's." A pause. Theo had never known Stuart well. Frank had made sure of that, or thought he had, though now he wondered what exactly he'd thought he was protecting. What kind of things? Frank didn't answer right away. He was looking at one of the photographs from the hidden shelf, the one from his commissioning ceremony. Taken from the back of the crowd, his father's face not visible, but his silhouette there recognizable. By the way he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, the same way Frank stood when he was watching something he cared about. "Letters?" Frank said. "Photographs. 30 years of watching without saying anything." Another pause. "Dad," Theo said carefully, "are you all right?" "No," Frank said, "but I think I'm going to be." 2 weeks later, Frank drove back out to Cranbrook. This time he brought Theo and Margot. He didn't have a plan exactly. That wasn't how it worked. He'd learned that much from the letters. His father had planned everything and still run out of time. What Frank had instead was a direction. He'd called Pallister Resources and declined the offer. The woman on the phone had been professional and unsurprised, and had told him they might reach out again if he ever reconsidered. He'd thanked her and hung up. He'd also made a call to a veterans organization he'd worked with briefly in Red Deer, a group that helped former service members transition to civilian life. with a particular focus on the ones who'd come home and found that home didn't quite fit anymore. He knew something about that. He'd asked if there was any interest in a partnership. The man he spoke to had gone very quiet and then said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, that yes, there was considerable interest. The property, Frank had decided, would become a working retreat, not a resort, something more like what his father had always used it for without ever naming it. A place where the silence was the point, where the work of the land, the maintenance of it, the rhythm of it, the simple physical fact of cutting wood and fixing fence and watching the creek freeze and thaw, could do the thing that talking sometimes couldn't. Give people back a version of themselves they thought they'd lost somewhere overseas. There were already 3 veterans' retreat operations in Alberta, none in this part of the Kootenay. His father had left him 17 acres and 33 years of unsent letters, and a dog who knew where the secrets were kept. He figured he could work with that. It was Theo who found the last photograph. They were clearing out the study on the second afternoon. Margot asleep in the main room in her carrier. Biscuit stretched out beside her with the proprietary ease of a dog who has decided someone is under his care. And Theo pulled a book from the shelf, and an envelope fell out from between the pages. Not a letter this time, just a photograph. It was Frank, maybe 8 years old, and his father standing at the edge of the woodshed. Frank was holding a hammer and looking up at Stuart with an expression that was pure, uncomplicated trust. His father's hand was on his shoulder. Both of them were squinting against the same patch of afternoon light. On the back, in his father's handwriting, "The day he helped me build the shelves. He didn't know they were for him." Theo held the photograph for a long time without saying anything. "I didn't know him," he said finally. "I know," Frank said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Theo said. He handed the photograph to Frank. "Just make sure Margot knows this place." Frank hung the photograph in the main house, in the hallway by the front door, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in. He figured that was the right place for it. First thing in, last thing out. He drove back to Red Deer at the end of the week to start the paperwork, to give notice on his apartment, to begin the slow process of moving a life from one place to another. Biscuit rode in the passenger seat with his gray muzzle on the window frame, and his eyes half closed against the wind. Somewhere east of the Rogers Pass, when the mountains were starting to flatten out and the sky opened up, the way it does on the Alberta side, Frank reached over and put his hand on the dog's back. Biscuit didn't move, just breathed, slow and even, the way dogs do when everything is exactly where it should be. Frank thought about his father standing at the back of a crowd 30 years ago, hands in his jacket pockets watching. He thought, "I see you now." And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the silence didn't feel like something to drive away.